He was a respected coach, a mentor to countless students, and a pillar of the community. She was a rising star, a talented cheerleader with dreams of a bright future ahead. To those who knew them, their interactions seemed nothing more than professional, a coach guiding his athlete toward success. But beneath the surface, behind the admiration and trust, lurked a dangerous obsession that no one saw coming. How does a bond built on guidance and mentorship shatter into something so dark? Were there warning signs that were ignored, missed, or simply brushed aside? What happens when someone meant to protect crosses the line in the most unforgivable way? This is the story of Rashawn DeLoach and Zaniyah Carrington, a case that shocked an entire community and left behind a trail of heartbreak and unanswered questions. Before we dive into the chilling details, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more true crime stories that uncover the hidden dangers lurking where we least expect them. Rashawn DeLoach had built a reputation that few could question. At 38, he was more than just the head coach of Langston High School's athletic program. He was a mentor, a father figure to many, and a respected member of the Houston community. He had once been a promising athlete himself, a former college football player whose dreams of going pro had been cut short by a devastating injury. Instead of letting the setback define him, Rashawn redirected his passion into coaching, determined to mold the next generation of athletes into something greater than himself. For over a decade, he had shaped Langston's sports program into one of the strongest in the district. His methods were disciplined but fair, his leadership commanding but never overbearing. Parents trusted him with their children, believing that under his guidance, their kids would learn not just about sports but about life, dedication, teamwork, resilience. He attended parent-teacher conferences, volunteered at school fundraisers, and even helped struggling students with their homework after practice. To the outside world, Rashawn DeLoach was the kind of coach every school wanted, the kind of man who left an impact long after students graduated. But no one knew that behind his carefully crafted image, something sinister was brewing. Zaniyah Carrington was exactly the kind of student Rashawn took pride in mentoring. At 17, she was everything a school could hope for in a student-athlete, talented, ambitious, and fiercely determined. She had been tumbling since she was 6, climbing through the ranks of competitive cheerleading with ease. By the time she reached high school, she had already made a name for herself, leading Langston's cheer team to multiple victories. She wasn't just a natural leader, she was the kind of person people gravitated toward. Charismatic but humble, competitive but kind, Zaniyah had an energy that made people believe in her. Teachers praised her work ethic, her friends adored her, and younger students looked up to her as a role model. Her dream was to cheer at the collegiate level, and she was well on her way. Recruiters had taken notice of her performances, and she had already received interest from several universities. For Zaniyah, senior year was supposed to be a time of celebration. She was months away from graduation, on track for a scholarship, and ready to take the next step toward her future. She had no idea that someone was watching her far too closely. To most, Rashawn's interactions with Zaniyah seemed like those of a supportive coach. He praised her leadership, encouraged her to push herself harder, and often reminded her that she had the potential to go far. No one questioned it. After all, he was like that with many of his students. But with Zaniyah, it was different. Rashawn noticed everything about her. The way her confidence radiated when she performed, the way her laughter filled the gym, the way she commanded attention without even trying. He told himself it was admiration, that he simply wanted to see her succeed, but deep down, it was something much darker. It started subtly, extra moments after practice, lingering conversations that stretched longer than necessary. Compliments that, while seemingly harmless, carried an undertone that should have raised alarms. When she sprained her ankle during practice, he was the first to help her off the mat, his touch lingering a little too long. When she stayed late to practice her routines, he always seemed to be nearby, watching, waiting. At first, Zaniyah thought nothing of it. Rashawn had always been supportive, always pushed her to be her best. But the closer he got, the more unsettling it became. The way he looked at her, the way his presence felt inescapable, it was as if she had become the center of his world. And she had. No one suspected that Rashawn's admiration for Zaniyah had crossed a dangerous line. No one saw the warning signs. And by the time they did, it was far too late. Rashawn DeLoach had always taken pride in his discipline. For years, he had upheld a reputation of professionalism, a coach who was respected, admired, and, most importantly, trusted. But all of that restraint, all of that carefully controlled discipline, had begun to unravel the moment he started watching Zaniyah Carrington a little too closely. At first, he convinced himself it was just admiration. She was a star athlete, after all. She had the kind of natural talent that didn't come along often, the kind of drive that made winners. It was only natural that he paid extra attention to her, that he pushed her harder than the others. That was his job, wasn't it? To shape young athletes into the best versions of themselves. But with Zaniyah, it wasn't just about coaching. He had been watching her for months now. At first, it had been unintentional. Quick glances during practice, noticing the way she moved across the mat, the effortless grace in her routines. Then, those glances stretched into something longer, something deeper. He started noticing things about her that had nothing to do with cheerleading, how she tied her shoelaces in the same meticulous way before every game, how she twirled the end of her ponytail when she was lost in thought, how she bit her lip when she was concentrating. It was intoxicating. He told himself it was harmless, but the way his eyes followed her in the gym, the way his thoughts lingered on her long after practice ended, said otherwise. He found himself paying closer attention when she spoke, memorizing the sound of her laughter, the inflection in her voice. He started anticipating her movements, knowing when she would be the last to leave, knowing when she would be alone. At first, he kept his distance, content with watching. But that wasn't enough. Not anymore. He started looking for ways to be near her, to insert himself into her daily routine. After games, when the gym was clearing out, he found excuses to linger, offering to help with equipment, knowing she often stayed late to practice her routines. During team meetings, he always positioned himself where he could watch her reactions, where he could see if she smiled, if she laughed, if she acknowledged him in any way. Then, there were the messages. It had started innocently enough, texting her about practice schedules, game day reminders, advice on technique. But soon, his messages began to shift. He started slipping in small compliments. "You were incredible today, Zaniyah. You're the most talented athlete I've coached. I can't wait to see how far you go." She responded politely, always professional, always respectful. And that only fueled him more. He started asking about her college plans, about where she saw herself in the future. And when she told him she had already received interest from universities, a strange kind of panic settled inside him. She was leaving. For months, he had built this silent obsession, convinced himself that what he felt was something deeper, something real. And now, the thought of her leaving, of her being beyond his reach, was unbearable. He watched her more closely than ever, every smile, every movement, every interaction. He noticed the way boys at school looked at her, the way her teammates surrounded her with admiration. The thought of her slipping away from him, of her giving her attention to someone else, was something he couldn't stand. The obsession consumed him. Every time she walked into the gym, it was like everything else faded. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears, could feel the way his pulse quickened when she got too close. He started finding reasons to touch her, a hand on her shoulder, a pat on her back, guiding her form under the pretense of correcting technique. Small, fleeting moments, but enough to send a thrill through him. Zaniyah, too focused on her goals, thought nothing of it. To her, he was just another supportive coach. But to Rashawn, she was something more. And now, with the clock ticking and her departure growing closer, he knew he had to act. He couldn't just watch anymore. He had to do something before she slipped away forever. October 14th was supposed to be a night of celebration. Langston High had just won one of the biggest football games of the season, and the entire school was buzzing with excitement. The cheerleaders had delivered a flawless performance, their energy electrifying the crowd. Students laughed, took pictures, and reveled in the victory, their cheers echoing through the night. Zaniyah was glowing. She had led the squad with confidence, every move precise, every chant filled with pride. As the night wound down, students began to filter out, heading off to after-parties or home to rest after the adrenaline rush. But Zaniyah, ever the responsible captain, stayed behind. She told her friends she'd help clean up the gym before heading home. It wasn't unusual, she did it all the time. Zaniyah didn't hear the gym doors close behind her. She didn't notice the shadow moving toward her as she bent down to pick up a stray pom-pom near the supply room. She was too focused, too distracted by the excitement of the night, unaware that the moment she turned around, her life would change forever. Zaniyah, Rashawn's voice was calm but firm. She spun around, startled. "Coach. You scared me." He smiled, but there was something off about it. Something she couldn't quite place. "Sorry about that. Just wanted to check in on you. You did amazing tonight." She relaxed, brushing off the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. "Thanks, Coach. We all worked hard." She turned back to grab the last of the supplies, expecting him to leave, but he didn't move. "You know," he said, stepping closer, "I've been watching you for a long time, Zaniyah. You're special." She frowned, confused. Thanks." He took another step, closing the space between them. "You don't even realize it, do you? How perfect you are. How much attention you get. But none of them appreciate you like I do." The uneasiness deepened into something more, something terrifying. She forced a laugh, trying to make light of his words. "Coach, it's late. I really need to get going." His hand shot out, gripping her wrist. Not hard, but firm enough to send a bolt of panic through her chest. "Why are you acting like this, Zaniyah?" His voice was soft, almost pleading. "I've done so much for you. I've been patient. I've been good to you." She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "Coach, let me go," she said, her voice shaking. "You don't understand, do you?" His breathing was heavy now. "I think about you all the time. The way you smile, the way you move, the way you look at me." Her stomach dropped. "I don't look at you," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Not like that." That was the wrong thing to say. His face twisted, something dark flashing in his eyes. "Don't lie to me," he snapped. "I see the way you act. You let those boys flirt with you, but when I try to tell you how I feel, you act scared." She yanked her wrist harder, her heart pounding. "I don't know what you're talking about. I need to go." His grip turned painful. "You're not going anywhere, Zaniyah." Panic exploded in her chest. She twisted, trying to break free, but he shoved her back, forcing her into the supply room. She stumbled, her back slamming against the shelves, knocking over boxes of sports equipment. "Please, Coach, don't do this," she begged, tears welling in her eyes. But he wasn't listening. The door shut behind them, and for the next terrifying minutes, Zaniyah's world became a nightmare. She fought. She screamed. She clawed at him, her nails raking across his skin, desperate to get away. But he was stronger. When it was over, she lay trembling, tears streaming down her face, her body aching. But she wasn't broken. She wouldn't let him win. She looked up at him, her voice raw with anger. "I'm telling." Rashawn froze. His breathing was ragged, his face slick with sweat. "What?" "You heard me," she spat, fire in her eyes despite her pain. "I'm telling everyone. You're going to jail." He stepped back, running a hand over his face. "You don't mean that." She glared at him. Try me. And that's when he knew, she wasn't bluffing. Panic twisted in his gut. He saw his entire life crumbling before his eyes. The respect, the career, the admiration, it would all be gone. Unless he stopped her. Zaniyah, he whispered, stepping closer again. You don't have to do this. I can take care of you. No one ever has to know. She shoved him. Don't touch me. His vision blurred with rage. Before he could stop himself, his hands wrapped around her throat. Her scream choked off into a desperate gasp. She fought again, clawing at his arms, but he squeezed harder. Tears streamed down her face, her body thrashing as she struggled for air. For a brief moment, he hesitated. He could stop. He could let go. But then, what? She'd run. She'd tell. His life would be over. No. It was too late. He tightened his grip. Zaniyah's body convulsed, her hands clawing weakly at his wrists. Then, slowly, the fight drained from her limbs. Her eyes, once so full of fire, dulled. And then she was still. Rashawn stumbled back, gasping, his hands shaking. She wasn't moving. He had killed her. The room was silent except for his own ragged breaths. The reality of what he'd done crashed over him like a wave. He wanted to take it back, to undo the last few minutes. But it was too late. Zaniyah Carrington was gone. What happened next was not recorded. But the evidence would later tell a horrifying story. When Zaniyah didn't return home, her mother, Latrice Carrington, immediately grew concerned. It wasn't like her daughter to be out late without checking in. Calls went straight to voicemail. Text messages remained unread. At first, Latrice assumed Zaniyah was caught up in the post-game excitement, maybe at a friend's house celebrating. But as the hours stretched on, an uneasy feeling settled deep in her chest. By midnight, panic set in. She called Zaniyah's closest friends, but none of them had seen her since they left the gym. That's when Latrice called the police. Morning arrived with a chilling discovery. A janitor, arriving early to clean, found the gym doors still unlocked. As he walked toward the supply room, something felt off. The air was thick, the silence too heavy. When he opened the door, the sight before him made his stomach drop. Zaniyah's body lay crumpled on the cold floor. Paramedics arrived quickly, but it was too late. The vibrant, talented cheer captain, the girl who had lit up every room she entered, was gone. Bruises told the story of a struggle. The torn fabric of her uniform, the defensive wounds on her hands, the marks along her skin, every detail pointed to the unthinkable. The school went into lockdown as news spread like wildfire. Students, teachers, and parents flooded the campus, desperate for answers. How could this happen? Who could do such a thing? Then, the footage surfaced. And when investigators saw Rashawn DeLoach following Zaniyah into that hallway, their questions turned into a chilling certainty. The school hallways were eerily silent the morning after Zaniyah's body was discovered. Students whispered in hushed tones, some crying, others staring blankly at their phones as the news spread like wildfire. A promising young cheerleader, gone. And no one knew why. Detectives arrived at Langston High before the first bell even rang, questioning students, teachers, and staff. They started with the boys on the football team. After all, Zaniyah had been popular, and rumors suggested she had been talking to someone. A secret boyfriend, maybe. Someone who didn't want her leaving for college. One by one, the boys were pulled from class, taken into a small office where Detectives Samuels and Perez sat waiting. Did Zaniyah have any enemies? Samuels asked, his eyes sharp, watching for any hesitation. Nah, one of the players said, shaking his head. Everybody loved her. Was she seeing anyone? Perez pressed. The player hesitated. I mean, not that I know of. I heard she was talking to some guy, but she never said who. The same vague answer came from several other teammates. Zaniyah had been texting someone, but no one knew who. The detectives exchanged glances. It wasn't much, but it was something. Then, they called in her closest friend, Malia Harper. Malia had barely spoken since the news broke. Her eyes were swollen, her hands gripping her sleeves as she sat across from the detectives. You were her best friend, Samuel started gently. If anyone knew who she was talking to, it would be you. Malia swallowed hard. She didn't have a boyfriend. At least, not one our age. Perez leaned forward. What do you mean? Malia hesitated, glancing at the door as if someone might be listening. Then, in a whisper, she said, she told me someone older was acting weird toward her. Samuel's stomach tightened. Who? Malia's voice barely rose above a breath. Coach DeLoach. Silence. Perez sat back in his chair, exchanging a knowing look with his partner. What do you mean, acting weird? Texting her, Malia admitted. Saying stuff that didn't feel right. She thought he was just being nice at first, but then he started showing up everywhere. Asking her personal questions. One time, she told me he stared at her for too long in practice. It freaked her out. Samuels tapped his pen against the desk. Did she tell anyone else? Malia shook her head. She didn't want to start drama. She said she could handle it. Her voice broke. I should have told someone. That was all the detectives needed. Rashawn DeLoach was called in for questioning that afternoon. He arrived in his usual athletic gear, a Langston high jacket zipped up to his neck. His expression was calm, maybe even a little sad, playing the part of the grieving coach. Coach DeLoach, Perez started, his tone even. Tell us about the last time you saw Zaniyah Carrington. Rashawn sighed, shaking his head. Man, it's terrible what happened to her. She was such a good kid. Last time I saw her was after the game. She was with the other girls, celebrating. I left early. Samuels tilted his head. You left early? Yeah, Rashawn said, nodding. Didn't stick around long. Perez slid a tablet across the table, pressing play on a grainy security clip. Then why do we see you walking into the gym minutes after she did? Rashawn's jaw tensed, but he recovered quickly. Oh, right. I must have forgotten. I went back to grab something from my office. Samuels didn't buy it. And you didn't see Zaniyah at all? He shook his head. No. Must have just missed her. Another clip played. This time, it showed him leaving the gym nearly an hour later. Alone. Rashawn's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Perez leaned in, lowering his voice. Coach, you need to be honest with us. Because right now, you're the last person to see her alive. Rashawn forced a laugh, shaking his head. Come on, man. You're saying I had something to do with this? That's crazy. But the evidence kept piling up. Phone records showed multiple late-night messages from Rashawn to Zaniyah. Deleted texts were recovered, texts that started off innocent but turned into something else. Compliments about her body. Comments about her beauty. Then, a final message from Zaniyah the night of the game, Coach, this isn't right. Stop texting me. 2 days later, Rashawn DeLoach was in handcuffs. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Reporters filled the back rows, cameras flashing as Rashawn DeLoach was led to the defense table, his once proud posture replaced by a rigid stiffness. On the other side of the room, Zaniyah Carrington's family sat silently, their grief evident in the dark circles under their eyes, their hands clasped together as if holding one another up. The trial had captivated the nation. The case wasn't just about a coach betraying his student, it was about power, trust, and the devastating consequences of obsession. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the facts. They painted a chilling picture of Rashawn's growing fixation, using months of text messages, surveillance footage, and forensic evidence to show how he had manipulated his position to get closer to Zaniyah. She trusted him, the prosecutor, Lauren Mitchell, told the jury, her voice unwavering. Her family trusted him. The school trusted him. And he used that trust to prey on a young girl. The jury flinched as they were shown the recovered messages, Rashawn's initial encouragement turning into something more insidious. His words had started with praise, then with subtle grooming, before they escalated into clear obsession. Then came the security footage. The grainy black and white clips showed Rashawn following Zaniyah into the gym that night. The jury watched as minutes turned to an hour, the footage confirming that no one else entered or exited during that time. When Rashawn finally emerged, he was alone. Then came the forensic evidence. Fibers from Rashawn's jacket found on Zaniyah's uniform. His DNA under her nails. The bruising on her wrists and neck. The medical examiner's testimony was devastating. Zaniyah had fought. She had tried to get away. But she never stood a chance. When it was the defense's turn, they tried to spin the story. Rashawn's lawyer argued that his client had only ever cared about Zaniyah, that any messages he sent were misinterpreted. He tried to argue for a lesser charge, claiming that whatever happened that night wasn't premeditated. But the jury didn't buy it. The trial lasted 2 weeks, but the jury only needed 3 hours to decide. When they returned, the courtroom was silent. Rashawn sat motionless, his fingers pressed together as if in silent prayer. The judge cleared his throat. On the charge of first-degree murder, how does the jury find the defendant? A beat of silence. Then, the foreman stood. Guilty. A sob broke out in the gallery, Zaniyah's mother collapsing into her husband's arms. Rashawn stared ahead, blinking rapidly, his jaw tightening, as if he had truly believed there was another outcome. The judge didn't waste time. Rashawn DeLoach, this court finds you guilty of the premeditated murder of Zaniyah Carrington. You used your position to manipulate, stalk, and ultimately take the life of a young girl who trusted you. For that, you will spend the rest of your life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no outburst from Rashawn, no dramatic breakdown. Just a slow shake of his head, as if refusing to accept his fate. The bailiffs moved in, cuffing his wrists. As they led him away, he turned slightly, whether to look at Zaniyah's family or the cameras flashing around him, no one could be sure. But it didn't matter. Because he would never walk free again. The halls of Langston High School were quieter now. The usual chatter and laughter had faded, replaced by whispers and solemn faces. Teachers carried on with their lessons, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air. An empty seat in class. A missing voice at pep rallies. A future stolen. The cheerleading squad, once the heartbeat of the school's spirit, struggled to move forward. Their routines felt hollow without Zaniyah's energy leading them. At practice, they would catch themselves glancing toward the spot where she used to stand, expecting to see her bright smile, only to be met with silence. The team decided to retire her uniform, framing it inside a glass case outside the gym. The plaque underneath read, "In loving memory of Zaniyah Carrington, forever our captain." The community mourned her in waves. Candlelight vigils illuminated the football field where she once cheered. Classmates shared stories, some tearful, others filled with laughter at memories of her wit and determination. The local news stations ran feature stories, highlighting Zaniyah's aspirations, her dreams of a scholarship, her plans to one day coach young girls like herself. Her mother, once a quiet, reserved woman, became a force of change. She channeled her grief into action, speaking at school board meetings, demanding stricter policies for teacher-student interactions, pushing for mandatory background checks, mental health screenings, and better training for school staff. No family should have to go through this, she said at one public hearing, her voice trembling but strong. No student should ever feel unsafe in the place meant to shape their future. Meanwhile, Rashawn DeLoach sat behind bars. The man once praised for his mentorship was now nothing more than another inmate. His name, once spoken with admiration, became a stain on the school's history. His obsession had destroyed everything: Zaniyah's life, his own future, the trust of an entire community. Langston High School would eventually move on, as all places do. But Zaniyah's absence was a wound that would never fully heal. The echoes of what happened would always be there, a reminder of the dangers that lurk beneath even the most trusted figures. And in the quiet moments, when the lights dimmed in the gym, some students swore they could still hear her voice, cheering, laughing, reminding them that she was once here. And that she should still be. Zaniyah Carrington's story is one that should have never ended this way. She was a young woman with ambition, talent, and a future full of promise. Her life was meant to be filled with achievements, laughter, and the dreams she worked so hard to reach. Instead, her story became a cautionary tale, a devastating reminder of how trust can be manipulated and how dangerous obsessions can turn deadly. Her community refuses to forget. Her family carries her memory with them, her classmates speak her name with both sorrow and love, and her absence is a wound that will never fully heal. Langston High School will always remember the girl who once led their cheers, the student who lit up every room she entered, the daughter and friend whose life was stolen far too soon. But this case raises painful questions. Were there warning signs? Were there moments where someone could have intervened? What more could have been done to prevent this tragedy? Schools are meant to be safe spaces, yet time and time again, stories like Zaniyah's prove that dangers can hide in plain sight. How do we ensure that no other family, no other community, has to suffer a loss like this? Zaniyah's name should not be just another headline or statistic. Her story is a call to action, a demand for better protection, for stricter policies, for vigilance in recognizing when something isn't right. Because no student should ever have their future stolen by someone they were taught to trust. If this story impacted you, take a moment to reflect, to share, and to stay aware. Because justice is not just about punishment, it's about making sure tragedies like this never happen again. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe.